Hello, I'm Paul Qualia, the founding Director of APAC Assistance. I'm based out of Singapore currently, though often in Myanmar, Indonesia and Thailand. Today I've got our South Asia team together and we're going to be talking about issues affecting Asia Pacific, and they are particularly related today to the US-China rivalry. I'll go through and introduce our people, or at least have them do so one by one, and they'll be assisting me today. Firstly, Bhargav Reddy, who is our Regional Operations Director based out of Bangalore. Bhargav.
Hello everyone, this is Bhargav Reddy joining you from Bangalore, India. I work as a Regional Operations Director for APAC Assistance. I supervise the Asia Pacific operations as well as the information services. I have a master's in international business and politics from Queen Mary University of London, and I've been in the industry for a while and I've worked with Pinkerton before. Over to you, Paul.
So Anshika, if you could now introduce yourself. Anshika is our information manager and is based out of Delhi.
Hi everyone, my name is Anshika. I'm the information manager for APAC Assistance. I'm based out of Delhi. I basically manage the information team, all the information regarding South Asia and East Asia Pacific. I have a background in law and politics from India, and I've worked at Teach for India for 2 years before joining APAC Assistance. I have extensive field experience as well as research experience.
Thank you, Anshika. Ragha, could you do the same? Ragha is our Assistant Manager for the Information and Analysis team based out of Bangalore.
Yes, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Rageshri. I'm working for APAC Assistance as an Assistant Manager. I'm based out of Bangalore. I've graduated from the University of Warwick with a Master's in International Relations, and also I've specialized in investment studies.
Thanks, Ragha. And Manzi, who's a research assistant and based out of India as well, from indeed Mumbai. Manzi, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Paul. Hello, everyone. I'm Mansi Gaude, and I work at APAC Assistance as a research assistant, and I'm based out of Mumbai, India. And I have a master's degree in international relations, also from the University of Warwick. That's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Manzi. So look, today we're going to cover off on how the various issues transpiring at the geopolitical landscape between China and the USA are going to affect East Asia and South Asia, indeed South Asia Pacific. And that's going to take us through India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Hong Kong, amongst other places, as well as the South China Sea. But initially, I'm going to ask Anshika, who's our information manager, to cover off in particular the South China Sea dispute issue in light of the current tensions. Please, Anshika.
Sure, Paul. As everyone probably knows, the South China Sea dispute's been a controversy for decades. The US does not directly claim any territory in the water, but the waters provide a key trade route for global shipping. They're rich in fish. They have large but mostly unproven energy deposits as well that all these countries are exploring. The US has China, even though have never engaged in not really engaged in a direct confrontation in the disputed waters, they have been meddling with each other in other ways. Now, considering the growing tensions between the two countries and their warships and fighter jets constantly coming close to each other with an increasing frequency, there is a greater risk of physical confrontation. Why I say this is because even if none of the countries may actually want to engage in a physical confrontation, they are so heavily militarized within the waters that any chances of miscalculation, any misjudgment could possibly lead to an accidental use of force, which could possibly result in an escalation. And this is a risk we cannot discount right now, considering the naval strength of both of these countries and their presence in the region. I'd give an example. In the first 4 months of the year itself, the US Navy has conducted 4 freedom of navigation operations. They're called FONOPs in the South China Sea. And last year, the US conducted 8 such operations. And during the Obama administration, I'm talking about 2015, 2016, there were only 2 to 3 of them. So this increasing frequency, even in these operations, which are mostly to counter China's territorial claims in the region. And this year, 2020, the US has already conducted 4 such operations, which puts it completely on track to surpass last year's total. Now, the US has also supported some smaller states against China's increased military presence in the area. One recent example is that US Navy recently engaged in a standoff with a Chinese vessel after twice sending warships on off the coast of Malaysia. Their Chinese ships were shadowing a Malaysian contract drill ship, and basically the US asked the Chinese vessel to back off. And most recently, China's defense ministry said that its Navy followed and expelled a US guided missile too in April. So this is just to show that the tensions are sort of rising and there is an increasing frequency of such meddling with each other, like I mentioned above. The Taiwan Strait is another site of dispute in the South China Sea. Now, Taiwan is very important to both China, as it claims Taiwan to be a part of China, and the US, because it has also keeps sending its warships there and sort of tries to make Taiwan the base to exert its influence in the region. So America has already said that it will sail its ships through the Taiwan Strait once a month, and even send a warship on a port visit. So this year we can expect American ships coming to Taiwan Strait once a month. And in mid-March, a group of Chinese military aircrafts also crossed the median line in Taiwan Strait. The median line is basically the unofficial demarcation line between Taiwan and China. Now this exercise was seen as and basically China's intention to intimidate Taiwan by demonstrating China's ability to conduct operations at night while also testing Taiwan's ability to react. Now, if this continues, if America keeps sending its ships through Taiwan Strait once a month and Chinese military also sort of keeps trying to cross this median line, we could see some form of an escalation in the eventual future with China trying to claim back Taiwan. So the conclusion is, even if they may not want a direct war or a physical confrontation, it definitely is a possibility as a result of accidental use of force, miscalculation, and misjudgment. Any questions so far?
Yes, and Shika, I do. How is that likely to affect the business community, particularly, and I'll get you to, after you answer my question, perhaps lead in and talk about how the current issues in Hong Kong are affecting the power status quo in the region between US and China. But the whole deliberation in the South China Sea, how's that likely to, or will it affect businesses operating in Asia Pacific region?
So many businesses definitely use South China Sea as a trade route. So the moment the environment becomes tense in the sea, the environment will also become tense for companies operating using these waters as a trade route. And other than that, if the escalation is going to trickle down to even other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, because China keeps trying to sort of breach their sovereign boundaries. So if the issue does escalate, it's not only going to affect US and China, it's also going to affect other countries, which in result may affect businesses. I think Raga will still be able to better comment on this, to expand on the point.
Yeah. So with regards to how it's playing out in the South China Sea and Hong Kong, we are noticing that there is an escalation even within the diplomatic language between the US and China. And there could be potential economic sanctions against Chinese companies, especially those that the US perceives to be detrimental to American interests. Apart from that, the US is also likely to take the route of with revoking the visas of diplomats in of China.
Okay, thanks. That's great, Rugger. Look, I think one thing we need to keep an eye on, guys, is particularly offshore Vietnam's very resource rich. Other nations in Asia, and it applies as well, but particularly in Vietnam, there's obviously particularly contentious issues. So let's continue to monitor that. And Shika, I might now just ask you to make comment on the situation in Hong Kong as it is relevant to the US-China escalations of political tensions.
Sure. So just to give a brief background, Hong Kong was a British colony till 1997, and it was handed over to China under the concept of one country and two systems. Under this system, Hong Kong basically enjoys a certain political and legal autonomy, and China controls the defense of the city. And last year saw some of the biggest protests in Hong Kong against a bill which basically the opponents of the bill believed would take away this autonomy, political and legal autonomy granted by that system. And the bill basically was an extradition bill, which would allow any criminals in Hong Kong and even foreign residents passing through for business from the city to be extradited to China. The bill had to eventually be shelved because there were very violent protests, and the numbers reached up to 1.7 million at a point. And they also felt that the law would deeply curb dissent in the country, and it will more or less become another city in China. Now, to give a little bit of more context, under the United States and Hong Kong Policy Act of '92, Washington treats trade differently with Hong Kong, basically provides certain trade concessions, almost zero tariffs to conducting trade from and to Hong Kong. And last year, with growing tensions in Hong Kong, the US passed the Hong Kong Human Rights Democracy Act. Now, this act is relevant because now that it's been passed, Washington will annually assess the city's level of autonomy from Beijing and cancel Hong Kong's trading privileges if that autonomy is compromised. Now, the tensions have erupted again this year because the Chinese government passed two controversial bills. One of them is the national security law, and the other one is a law against disrespecting Chinese national anthem. Now, the national security law criminalizes any activity of secession, subversion, terrorism, and foreign interference, and is very broad in a way that it can do so. Meanwhile, the national anthem law criminalizes disrespecting the Chinese national anthem. So now the protesters are saying that this essentially does away with the one country, two systems agreement. And in May this year, very recently on May 27th, US Secretary announced to Congress that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous and does not enjoy a high degree of autonomy from China. Now the announcement from the US Secretary is coming as tensions between the US and China continue to escalate. The US has threatened consequences to Beijing over steps to assert more control over Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's special status basically has been jeopardized. It could potentially be revoked considering these ongoing tensions. And now what would this revocation mean for businesses? This would open a range of options. There could be visa restrictions of Chinese diplomats in the US, asset freeze for top officials, possibly imposing tariffs on goods coming from Hong Kong. So these are a number of things that would affect businesses. And it would effectively mean that US will treat Hong Kong no differently than any other Chinese city if they actually take away this special status from Hong Kong. And an estimated USD 38 billion in trade between Hong Kong and US is at stake because of this. So that would be my conclusion for now. Any questions, Paul?
Look, nothing from me. If there's nothing from others, I might move along. Okay, no questions there from the team. What I might now do is ask Rugger, obviously the ongoing bantering around trade clearly sends a signal to the world that both China and the US are very much looking after their own interests. Now, the world needs and has needed the US to be a superpower and to represent them. But in the last administration, we've seen the US be particularly poignant in looking after its own interests, and its recent issues where it's proven to have either got their intelligence wrong or perhaps worse, misrepresented their intelligence to get support from their allies, combined with a more myopic view on trade and a more inner-looking focus, is allowing China, who also thinks it is the future superpower, to stretch its tentacles even wider. Of great concern is both countries think that they have the least to lose and the most to gain. So there doesn't seem to be a willingness to meet in the middle. So Ruggia, with your background, especially on the economic side, I might ask you to look at that US-China trade war and the words of war in a little bit more detail, please.
Sure, Paul. You make a fair point on the myopic view of things right now. I'll just elaborate a little bit further. So when we look at the economic issues that are being faced, we've got to understand the breadth of the relationship between the US and China. The US goods and services trade with China totaled an estimated $737 billion in 2018. The US trade deficit with China was about $419 billion in 2018. China was the largest supplier of goods to the US in 2018, and the main categories of imports were computers, mobile phones, clothing, and sporting goods. A significant portion of imports are from US manufacturers that send raw materials to China for low-cost assembly, and once they're shipped back, they are considered imports. China's main imports from the US are commercial aircraft, soybeans, and semiconductors. China produces consumer goods at lower cost than other countries, and buyers are naturally attracted to the lower prices. And China's competitive pricing is partially a result of two factors. One, it has a lower standard of living than the West. And the second is that it has an exchange rate that is partially fixed or pegged to the dollar. Now, America is in a conundrum and it cannot implement trade protectionism. And as much as we hear the rhetoric about America first, it's almost impossible to actually follow through on it because consumers would have to pay higher prices for locally manufactured goods. US companies that cannot compete with Chinese goods have two options. One is the lower costs, which is impossible, or they'd have to go out of business. So it's unlikely that the trade deficit will change, especially long term. And overall, we can see that manufacturing jobs in the United States have declined by about 27% since 1998. The recent trade war that we saw about 2 years ago between the US and China is motivated by America's desire to curb or curtail the bilateral trade deficit. Now, Trump has argued that the US must counter the unfair trade practices of China and has threatened to apply tariffs. He has signed executive orders calling for tighter tariff enforcement in anti-subsidy and anti-dumping trade cases. He's ordered a review of US trade deficits and their reasons. The trade war between the two countries has escalated and has hurt both countries and the world economy at large. Trump implemented a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum that went into effect on July of 2018. This impacted about $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. In a tit-for-tat response, China canceled all import contracts for soybeans. This perception of unjust trade terms has led to increasing demands from Washington. Not only should we view this as an economic war, but it can be viewed as a strategy by Washington to contain the rise of China. Finally, after long negotiations between the two countries, an agreement was taking shape, and in December of 2019, Trump announced a trade deal between the US and China. In January of this year, President Trump signed an initial agreement with China. This is still in its first phase of talks, and the agreement aims to open Chinese markets to more American companies, increase farm and energy exports, and provide increased protection for American technology and trade secrets. Also, China has agreed to buy an additional $200 billion worth of American goods and services by 2021, and this is expected to ease some of the tariffs on American products. I'll quickly move into a buzzword that's being talked about a lot in economic circles, which is global supply chain restructuring, sorry. So global supply chains are exploring the options to diversify in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses are beginning to realize and recognize the value for diversification, and wholesale shifts in supply chain may not be in the horizon for businesses because of high costs, but there is somewhat of a long-term process that is underway. Adjustments to improve the preparedness and lessen the blow of some future COVID-19 kind of supply chain shocks are coming and likely overdue. Trump has ordered US companies to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. The recent outbreak of COVID-19 in China could present an opportunity for countries such as India as an alternative supply chain market, particularly for electronics manufacturing and auto component sector. The de-risking of supply chains originating from China is likely to be accelerated on the backs of concerns over the recent outbreaks. The process was initiated initially following heightened concerns of a US-China trade war, but the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated this process. It has forced companies to look for alternatives. The process of moving production out of China is fairly expensive and it cannot be implemented quickly. Alternative markets to China have been identified in countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and Bangladesh. Moving production to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, or elsewhere may incur greater costs, and expensive materials will need to be imported probably from China. Some of the deterrence is that there are additional costs involved, which include training of new labor, management, additional capital expenses, and higher costs that kind of come with a loss of scale efficiency. So overall, to conclude, I would say that global supply chain restructuring is underway. A lot of countries are already talking about it. A lot of countries are posing themselves as viable alternatives to China. It remains to be seen how much of this will be implemented, especially in the long term, because in the short term, it's not viable. However, in the long term, many countries have started taking steps to address these issues. That's it from me. Paul, any questions?
No, Rugger, I think that was very complete. I think there's two things that we do need to flag as we're researching and analysing the region and this power battle going on. One is America is often retracting under its current administration from various agreements of an economic nature and even bilateral or multilateral agreements. So that's lessening the confidence in what used to be a very solid administration to the outside world. Secondly, please also note that Japan has offered its companies a very large fund. I can't remember exactly how big a fund, but for countries to relocate into ASEAN. Certain countries within ASEAN have a significant advantage over India and Bangladesh in that they have less red tape and their location is in some ways strategically better. India and Bangladesh, neither of them are famous for well-developed infrastructure. So I think we'll be surprised that when we see some of the divesting out of China and reinvesting, that ASEAN may surprise everybody on how large a share it gets. So please continue to monitor that, Rugger, okay?
Sure, Paul.
Okay, what I might now do is, I guess while I'm talking about India, and for those international audiences in Europe and the Americas, it's interesting to note that China has, 1.4 billion people. India has 1.3 billion people, but its population is growing more quickly. The Asia Pacific region, by the year 2040, will be 40% of the global economy. Right now, China is, on a PPP basis, the largest economy in the world. Sure, on a straight GDP figure, US is still years ahead, but in terms of purchase power, China is already there. I often sit back late at night and think, is America playing the game that's in front of them, or is it playing the game it wants to be in front of them? And that could spell danger if they're not realistic about how critical Asia Pacific is and the upward trends in these emerging superpowers, initially China, but not so far away, India too. India, of course, has its limitations that, unlike China, it's a democracy. And so its decision-making is slower, and the complexities of and magnitude of the number of states and the separate administrations adds an enormous complexity that China does not have to deal with. But all that said and done, US and China and US and India and the growth of India and China are key factors for international communities to be intimately aware of. I might ask Mansi now to expand on the whole issue, particularly on the China-India border and that particular region. Thanks, Mansi.
Thanks, Paul. So speaking of the US and China rivalry in general, it is important to note that the power dynamics between the two countries are no longer restricted to the East Asia Pacific region alone. Like you mentioned, both the countries have been vying for influence in the larger South Asia region, especially since the emergence of China as an economic superpower in the recent past. While the US has been present in the region for nearly 2 decades, through its role in Afghanistan, and China's presence in the region is relatively recent. Since 2013, China has massively ramped up investment and infrastructure across the region under the larger Belt and Road Initiative project. This essentially gives China access to some of the most strategically important ports and trade routes in the region. And due to the changing geopolitical dynamics, Pakistan, which is also an important player in the region, has aligned itself closely with Beijing, while India has shifted its strategic alliance to the United States. This is evident with the development of the China and Pakistan economic corridor, which gives Beijing direct access to the Gwadar port in Pakistan's Balochistan province. Their increased influence in the region has posed a massive challenge to India also, who is trying to exert its own influence in the region, and in an effort to counter the growing China-Pakistan nexus in its immediate neighborhood. The strategy is to form a strategic partnership based on a shared goal, and the renewed strategic partnership is viewed by many as a pragmatic approach to manage China's rise in the Indo-Pacific region. India claims that the China-Pakistan and economic corridor is an infringement on its territorial integrity, and it violates its sovereignty as it passes through the disputed territory of Gilgit-Baltistan in the region, in Kashmir. And China has been alleged by foreign policy observers of using the string of pearls strategy to expand its influence in South Asia for the strategic encirclement of India. And India is largely seen as an aggressor, or rather a hegemonic figure by other smaller nations in South Asia, like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and also Bangladesh to an extent. And countries like these have therefore aligned themselves more closer towards Beijing rather than New Delhi. And it is important to note that the US-India strategic partnership is greatly influenced by the changing power dynamics between the United States and China on a global platform. While the India and the United States partnership continues to feature prominently in the strategic calculations of both the countries, New Delhi remains largely pragmatic about what it can expect from Washington. And to speak of and speaking of controlling China's influence in the region, the United States and India have also been engaged in a rather informal and a diplomatic and military engagement called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, along with two other nations, including Japan and Australia. It is largely seen as a measure to contain China's expansionist activities in the South and East China Seas. These countries occasionally carry out joint military and exercises, which are called which are termed as Exercise Malabar, and these countries primarily converge on the shared values of democracy, and you can basically call it a value-based alliance, which is committed to a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region based on shared principle and values. The Quad also includes some Southeast Asian countries, such as Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, in conducting military exercises in the region. And to conclude, I would like to say that the dynamics in South Asia remain complex, and it is an evolving situation. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks very much. You raise a very good point that I hadn't considered, and that's the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Bhargav, I might get you to actually give that relevance to Sri Lanka and Pakistan, as particularly Pakistan's quite a key player, but the BRI's relevance in those regions is even more pronounced. Could you please cover off on that?
Thank you, Paul. China has been quite exuberant and enthusiastic about spreading its tentacles across the world, all the way till Slovenia, with its Belt and Road Initiative. So what it basically plans to do is pump in money for infrastructure projects, which in return stimulate economic activity in the respective countries. And in the context of South Asia, two of the major countries which have received a large chunk of these loans include Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Now, the economic realities and feasibilities are a different matter altogether. The BRI initiative includes everything from a mega highway project cutting across the entire country, like in Pakistan, till an international port, like in Sri Lanka, which is called Hambantota Port. Now, the economic viability is fairly convoluted. If we look at it from an economic theory perspective, the big push theory actually supports the initiative, saying that any industry to come up requires a major big push from the government or an external agency to bring in basic infrastructure for businesses to thrive or to start investing. Unfortunately, infrastructure and the big push is only one of the many elements which are required to develop a national or international industry within a given period. In Sri Lanka itself, Sri Lanka has borrowed over $1.4 to $1.7 billion from China, which has actually put more pressure on its balance of payments. And they were unable to repay China or keep up with their yearly payments to China, which basically resulted in handing over or leasing out of Hambantota port to China. At the same time, in Pakistan, there is a lack of transparency as well, because the administration within the country is managed or directly or indirectly managed by the Pakistani military. And there is basically a lack of transparency around how much is being invested in what projects. Okay, the CPEC or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project is not one single project, but the signature of the project is the Gwadar port, which tries to compete with the Chabahar port across the border in Iran, funded by India. Now, the realities of such projects remain with how much of business these projects can actually fuel and sustain. And if it doesn't sustain the amount of business in proportionate to the amount of money invested, with the help of a debt, they're going to collapse under its own weight. And that has been seen in Pakistan, who have struggled to grow more than 3 to 4% a year. Sri Lanka is topping around 2 to 3% again, as opposed to a counterexample of Bangladesh, which has been extremely cautious in taking external debt and focusing on its capacity to produce with cheap labor, basically supporting the global garment industry, has been growing around 6 to 7% a year in the last 3 years. So that's the reality of the BRI project. And this is precisely why China has been accused of practicing debt trap diplomacy, wherein they lay roots through their extremely problematic debt to these smaller countries who may see their debt from, or the loans from China as a boon for their developing economy. I mean, it's needless to say, capital infusion in any developing economy is a prerequisite for their long-term growth. However, unless the debt repayments are managed, the same debt can be a burden in the long term, or in the short term for that matter. Any questions, Paul?
Look, I think you covered off it really well. I might just, and correct me if I'm wrong, but relevance of Hambantota ports is because of its strategic location. Just for our international members, Sri Lanka is obviously a large island directly to the south of India. Hambantota port's on the southern end of Sri Lanka. So the major capital city in Sri Lanka is on the southwest corner, just to the south of that. So a city called Galle. And the port is actually dead center of the south coast of the island, and thus its strategic value. Bhargav, anything to add to that strategic location?
You're absolutely right, Paul. Yes, the port itself is in the southern tip of Sri Lanka, which may seem like a strategic place for a port. However, a port will only be useful when there's enough business generated around the port to use the port and generate revenue from taxes and other charges, right? But unfortunately, Sri Lankan economy is not strong enough to support such a big port, built with an investment of nearly $1.3 billion, right, overburdening the entire economy.
Yes, but let me just qualify that. You said it's only of use. You meant only of use to a local government if it's of great strategic use to China.
Yes, for China, yes, but you need to understand this in context. From the context of Sri Lanka and its economy and its scale, it will be an overburdening project as far as Sri Lankan economy is concerned, domestically and as far as balance of payments are concerned. But for China, it's both strategic as well as economic. Once they have roots in one of these regional economies, they have a stronger footprint to counterbalance in terms of geopolitical context against India, because Sri Lanka sits a few kilometers off the coast of the southern coast. So they couldn't have asked for a better launch pad. Exactly.
Well, look, if there's no further questions from the team, and if there is, please just jump on in. But for this kind of analysis, APAC Assistance, we're a bespoke company. We've got people across the East Asia, South Asia region. We have analysts, researchers, as well as experienced operational people. Our membership clients basically engage with us to get a depth and a breadth of understanding of Asia Pacific to enable better business decisions. If you want to reach out to us, you can find myself, Paul Qualia, via my LinkedIn profile, or contact Regional Director Bhargav Reddy at bhargav_reddy@apacassistance.com. Really appreciate my team taking time out of their busy day on what is in the region of Friday afternoon. Thanks very much, everyone, for your contributions, and please do reach out to us if you're looking to supplement or improve your advice to your businesses in the Asia Pacific region. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.